Housing, latest Inside Housing webinar on fire safety in association with Rockwool, asking the question, are the new regulations enough? My name is Peter Apps, I'm the Deputy Editor here at Inside Housing, and I will be chairing the event today. So thanks everyone who's joining us around the country to listen to the discussion. I can see some of you logging in and coming online now. So by way of introduction, over the last 2 years, there have been few issues in the housing sector which have attracted more attention than fire safety for the obvious reason of the terrible events at Grenfell Tower in June 2017. In many ways, it feels like this attention has brought to light an almost never-ending list of problems. External facades, of which ACM is just one type of cladding which has given the industry pause for concern. Fire doors, windows, poor compartmentation. We know that the system, as it was before Grenfell, did not deliver safe buildings frequently enough. The government's tried to respond to this in a number of ways. There's been a ban on combustible materials in new build, and the recommendations of the Hackett Review set out an attempt at holistic reform. But these actions have not been without criticism, and today our webinar asks, do they go far enough? We want to know whether they've correctly identified the problems and whether the actions they've recommended really will make a difference. In particular, we're going to be talking about things like whether or not the ban on combustibles should be extended, what to do about existing buildings with problems, and whether the efficiency of solutions such as sprinklers can solve the issues that we're facing. And to lead us through the discussion, we're very lucky to be joined by two expert panelists. The first we're going to hear from in a moment is Mark Norris, who is the Principal Policy Advisor at the Local Government Association. Mark has been in that role since 2015, and his roles include leading its policy work relating to fire and rescue services. Of course, following the events at Grenfell Tower in 2017, Mark's role took on new significance, and he's been responsible for the LGA's building safety related work ever since. This has included participating in the working groups established to inform the final recommendations in Dame Judith Hackett's review of building control and fire safety. And he's also a member of the Joint Regulators Group established by the government to help implement the new building safety framework set out in Dame Judith's final report. So I'm very lucky to have Mark joining us today. And with Mark, who you'll hear from after he's finished his presentation, is Jim Glockling. He is the Director of the Risk Authority and the Technical Director of the Fire Protection Association. Jim's had a long and winding career in fire safety. It's involved academic research, lecturing on fire safety, and work as a forensic fire safety investigator. From 2002 to the present day, he's been at the Fire Protection Association, where he continues to undertake research into fire protection, and he's worked extensively with the Association of British Insurers, the Ministry of Defence, and other clients in developing the next generation of fire safety management strategy, equipment, and policies. These studies have been many and varied in nature, and Jim is one of the foremost experts in many of the issues which we'll be touching on over the next hour. So that's what we'll be talking about today, and those are our experts. Please do, as the discussion continues, put your questions into the question and answer section, which you can see on your dashboard in front of you. We'll do the Q&A at the end, but we've left a reasonable length of time available for it, and it would be really helpful for everyone, I'm sure, certainly for our two panelists, if you can throw in any questions that you do want answered as their presentations go on. So yeah, just throw them in there as they come up, and we'll be able to pick them up at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark Norris, who is ready and waiting to take you through his presentation. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Peter. And what I'm going to do is give you sort of a whistle-stop overview, I think, of what's going on and has happened over the last 2 years and where we are now and what the issues are facing the social housing sector in particular in terms of addressing the issues that we face around building safety. And within that, that's not only around fire safety, but also structural safety issues that we've identified. So in terms of the overview of where we are, from the LJ's perspective, we've had a lot that's come out. Peter ran through some of those points in his introduction about where we are and what the issues are that are being faced by the country as a whole, but particularly by landlords, and including in those social landlords and local authorities also in terms of their wider role of looking after the built environment in their particular area. So the initial focus after Grenfell, of course, was immediately on ACM rain screen cladding. And one of the first points that we made in respect to that was actually it's not just the rain screen cladding that you need to look at, it's what sits behind it. So it's the insulation as much as the rain screen cladding itself, which poses a threat. And that was backed up, obviously, by the results that we got from the government's testing in 2017 in the summer of that year, which exposed that when you combine various types of ACM with various types of combustible insulation, you have a very dangerous mix, which is a threat to fire safety on buildings. Our view has always been, since 2017, that in fact ACM is not the only one out there. And we know that government is currently testing a range of other products, 7 of them, in a variety of different formats, which include zinc and copper composite material rain screen cladding systems. Our sense is that if those are in any way similar in terms of methods of construction to ACM, then we should have a result which says that possibly those are problematic. There are a range of other ones there that they're also testing, including a high-pressure laminate, and we've already had, as of last month, the first test result from that in terms of doing a Class B, European classification Class B HPL panel combined with non-combustible insulation, one of the Rockwool products, I think. And that came back with a pass result, but based on the results that have come from that and other tests that have been carried out prior to it, government, through the expert panel, has now advised building owners that high-pressure laminates represent a threat, particularly Class C and D on their own are not safe, and Class B, when combined with combustible insulation, needs to be removed. It's a bit difficult when you read the expert panel advice note 22 to decide whether or not, what kind of equivalence there is between the HPL results and those for ACM. Our reading here at the LGA is that when you compare what they're saying about ACM category 3, which is the worst performing ACM categories, with the HPL products, that broadly the expert panel's view seems to be, and this is our interpretation and may be wrong, that HPL in combination with combustible insulation poses the same kind of threat to building safety that ACM category 2 does. So the government's in the course of obviously seeking remediation of buildings which include ACM category 2 when combined with combustible insulation. So that suggests to us that we're only part way through the process of identifying what types of systems are problematic, and that if you have an HPL system on your building as a landlord, whether private or social, you should be looking to see what sits behind it and also investigating which type of classification it is to ensure that your building is safe. As we've seen from the evidence that came out of the Grenfell inquiry, of course, and we'll await Sir Martin Moore-Bick's report later this year with interest, there was a good deal exposed in terms of other issues with the way that the rain screen cladding system on Grenfell Tower itself had been installed, issues with the cavity barriers and other key elements of the fire safety systems that should have worked or should have been in place to help prevent the spread of fire don't work. And we know, and I've heard anecdotally from a range of people, that when people have looked at other buildings subsequent to Grenfell, that a whole range of things have been uncovered as a result of that. Alongside that, as a result of the police investigation into the Grenfell fire, we've now learnt that glass reinforced plastic composite fire doors do not meet the 30-minute requirement that they are supposed to under the building regulations. There's been ongoing discussions over the last 18 months between ourselves and government about what that means for social landlords in terms of looking to replace those doors. Key questions being, is there a door or a product they can buy which is as cheap and as good quality as ones that they purportedly bought, which they thought were going to be safe, which aren't? And how do you identify which doors you need to replace, given that it's not entirely clear from the test data that's been assembled so far which doors might or might not, and the glass reinforced plastic side meet meet the requirement. Government has said none of them do. The manufacturers are saying that they don't entirely agree with that position. So it's an interesting kind of position where we are. In fact, we're not much further on, I think, from where we were probably a year ago in terms of trying to arrive at a process which helps social landlords identify and then replace and pay for the new doors that they need to install. Alongside that, we've also identified a range of other building issues. Most probably the foremost of our sort of thinking at the moment on that has been around large panel system buildings, ones constructed along the same method as Ronan Point from the 1960s, and obviously came out in terms of issues raised by residents back in 2017 in states in Southwark, for example, but also in other London boroughs, where issues have been found with the construction of those buildings, but also with the fact that those buildings have aged considerably over the 50 to 60 years that they've been in existence, and in some instances are well built, are probably reaching the end of their useful life. So in summary, I think we're in a position where, from a local authority perspective, there's two issues that government needs to address, and building owners also need to be thinking about, and local authorities need to be thinking about in a more broader sense, is how do we put right what we know is wrong on buildings, and then the broader point which leads us into Hackitt, and I'll come on to that briefly in a minute, is what do we do to ensure that the problems that we've uncovered so far aren't repeated in the future. So from the LJ's point of view, how do we put right what is wrong with the buildings that we've got at the moment? Our overarching priority over the last 2 years has obviously been ensuring that we collectively keep residents safe and make sure that they feel safe when they're in those buildings. As a result of lobbying by us and other organisations and some of the work that Inside Housing's been doing to put pressure on government, we've seen two sets of remediation plans put in place, one relating to the social housing sector, where £400 million initially was indicated. In fact, government was flexible in terms of how much was available, and our understanding so far is that expenditure has come in below that level, but money was made available to social landlords to remediate those buildings with ACM cladding on and strip that off. That's led to considerable progress in terms of doing it, and the latest statistics show a good number of buildings in the social housing sector have completed the remediation process, but obviously it's a work in progress on some of the other buildings, given the complexities that we see with the cladding systems that have been installed and how those work. So understandably, it's not going to be a simple process, and in some instances it takes quite a bit of time to take the cladding off and then replace it. Progress on the private housing sector has obviously been much slower, and that's partly in our view, or more than partly in our view, a result of lack of clarity about where the funding would come to pay for this, and which is why we welcomed the government's commitment to provide funding to high-rise residential landlords to carry out remediation on their blocks. There's now funding being made available for them to do that. The interesting thing will be to see whether or not how widely that is taken up, given that there's a deadline to take up the funding offer by the end of December, but to have completed the works by June next year. And there are a number of caveats as to how that funding can be used, and some requirements in terms of how private landlords go through the process of getting that money, and what they need to provide MHCLG with in terms of evidence to show that they're entitled to get it. As I said, it's clear that there are other materials out there which are dangerous. As I've already mentioned, the government's testing regime that's been going on, and apologies briefly for the background noise that's going on here, but we're sceptical that the tests that have been carried out, which are bespoke ones, which have been developed by the Building Research Establishment, will give us an accurate idea of what's going on. Because I think in our view, even though, for example, the BS 8414 test, the large scale system test isn't ideal, it does at least provide us with an idea of how panels with insulation and other parts of what's on the side of a building are ones that you can work through and identify how those work in combination, and whether or not there is a risk posed for it. Testing the panels on their own seems to us an attempt to kind of shortcut processes, and it's not clear entirely that you come up with a view which tells you actually how that panel works in combination with other key elements of the cladding system. So we've always been sceptical about the value of doing those tests that the government's been doing and what they'll show. We still await the results of that and seeing when those will come out. We understand that there'll be a process whereby the results, once they're completed, go to the expert panel. The expert panel will then decide on what further action needs to be taken, if any, and then government will publish the results alongside the recommendations from the expert panel. And we wait to see what those are. But our expectation, given we've also already had the test results in respect of HPL, which indicates they are problematic, that there'll be some other ones that come out of it. And if there aren't, I think that raises further questions in our heads about the testing process. Of course, with the HPL panels already being identified as problematic, our understanding, and others will know better than we do, how widely those are used in the construction industry. Some data that we have seen, which is very limited and related to small areas within London, suggests that it's quite, the numbers will probably exceed those in terms of ACM potentially if that's replicated more broadly across London and then more broadly across the country, which is interesting in where we are with the remediation of ACM buildings. So I think our view is that we're going to have to be in a position where we end up looking to government to look to fund the further remediation of all of these blocks. And alongside that, of course, as I mentioned, we've got this issue with the GLP composite fire doors and the fact that at the moment we don't have products on the market which social landlords can buy to replace the doors that they have got which they need to replace, and there's no clarity about the funding. So far we've had kind of penny packages of funding which bring slightly more generous to government, which cover off a good deal of the funding that needs to be done to do some of the remediation work. But our view is that we're coming to a position where you probably need to look at a comprehensive solution which picks up all of these things in terms of packages of funding and where those go. And there's a question about whether or not those fit in with other solutions and whether or not some of those might be more cost effective, such as installing sprinklers in blocks than some of the options we've been currently talking about. Then that brings us on to Dame Judith's report, which is obviously looking at how we fix the problem we're in now. At the heart of her conclusions was that the current regulatory system is not fit for purpose and we need to have a new framework in place for high-rise residential buildings. At the core of what she recommended in her final report was that we have a new regulator. The terminology of the name of that regulator is shifting as we go on. She talks about a joint competence authority between councils, fire and rescue services and the health and safety executive. But underlying that was that this new regulator needs to have more robust enforcement powers and sanctions. Alongside that, she was very clear about there need to be a shift in responsibility for building safety from effectively relying on compliance with the regulations and what you were told by regulators to those people responsible for buildings, whether that's people who are commissioning the building of them, commissioning work, or actually the landlords of them while they're in occupation, to have responsibility for what goes on, and the primary responsibility sits with them. Alongside that will be a new approvals process for buildings which are in scope, and it's interesting to see, and I'll come back to that briefly at the last slide, just in terms of what buildings might be caught in scope. But effectively, those people responsible for buildings will have to pass through 3 gateways. The first one at planning, the second one before they start actual construction work, having been through the building control process, and the final one before they come into occupation of the building. And you won't be able to pass through those hoops in what Dame Judith Hackett recommended unless you've satisfied the regulator that you understand what you're doing and they're satisfied that the measures you put in place in terms of building safety will deliver a safe building. There's a range of other things in there that she talks about, some key elements of what will need to be in there around competition within the building control environment and reducing that, as her view, which is one we share, is that the competition between local authorities and improved inspectors has resulted in a process where standards have been driven down rather than up, and that needs to be addressed. That we need better information about the buildings we build, and that information about what's being built or what work's been done is handed on from the people who carry it out in a way that means we have accurate records of what's on those buildings and what's been done to them going forward. And that's a key bit of what Dame Judith Hackett recommended about having a golden thread, and that information then forms the core of a safety case which the regulator can look at once the building's in occupation to decide whether or not it's safe and whether or not there are any other measures that need to be introduced by the building owners to ensure the safety of the residents there. One of the key bits that came out of the Grenfell story itself was the fact that residents had themselves been raising issues of safety concern with Grenfell long before the fire took place and warning that a catastrophe might happen. So one of the key bits that Dame Judith Hackett recommended was that there's better information flow from landlords and anybody carrying out work on a building down to the residents so they understand what's going on, and that there's better ways for residents to raise issues when they come across them. And alongside that, there needs to be improved competency across the construction industry, I think, both in terms of those regulating it, but also in those in terms of doing the building work, and that needed to be addressed. And along an additional point as well that she raised was that given concerns about the product testing, and which again the LGA agrees with, is we need a much more effective product testing regime before we go any further. Which brings me on to the final slide from me, which is where have we got to so far. So while Dame Judith has made her final report, one of the key bits that it missed out in our view, and I think probably that of Rockwool, was that it didn't ban combustible materials on buildings as we'd called for. That was then addressed by the government last summer, and the ban then came into effect on December this year just gone. The question is about whether or not that extends to the right way and covers all the materials that it needs to. And alongside that ban, there was also a look at the use of desktop studies in terms of approving documents and use of materials rather that goes on high-rise buildings, and that's been severely restricted. Alongside that, we've also seen revisions to Approved Document B, the statutory guidance from government, which sets out how you meet the fire safety requirements. These are designed to improve the clarity of that document. They have done to some extent, I think, but I don't think we, from the LGA's perspective, are convinced entirely that what we've ended up with is a document that's understandable as we saw it by people who work on construction. So our view was you needed to have a document that you could give to anybody working on the building, and they would be able to understand the requirements set out in it. And I'm not sure that we are there, but one of the key bits that we were concerned about was Section 12 of what was the old version of Approved Document B, which, in our view, the lack of clarity in that and the confusion created by it resulted in some of the problems that we've seen in terms of discussions about whether or not it was illegal to use ACM cladding on the side of buildings or not. In our view, and they're set out in the bullet points there on the side, there are still a range of issues that need to be considered and decided on, and there still haven't been. What's the scope of the new regulatory framework? To which buildings does it apply? Defining it by height, in our view, is a rather arbitrary measure of deciding risk, and actually there should be much greater focus on risk. And there are some low-rise buildings where you have vulnerable residents who might find it difficult to evacuate a building, and actually we believe that those should be included in scope as part of this process, and that certainly Dame Judith Hackett's requirement that it only extend to buildings over 10 stories in height was too limited, and it should be extended much more widely than that. There's also a question about how is the new regulatory framework delivered? Is it delivered by a national regulator, or is it continued to deliver by local agencies, but one's working better together? The further question is about, related to that and spins off from it, is do we risk, in terms of looking at high-rise residential buildings, as one subset of buildings and building safety with a new regulatory regime which applies to them, and end up creating a two-tier system of building safety within the country where you have one set of buildings which are held to a higher standard than any others? And is that the right thing to be doing? Within all of this, of course, we need to be able to look at buildings holistically, and that includes the difficult decisions about what to do when you have a building which is in mixed commercial, for example, and residential use. Who's responsible for enforcement about it? How do you look at that building and the development in which it sits holistically, and how does the regulator work within that framework? Again, it's not entirely clear at the moment how we navigate our way through that. The focus in much of the work that's been done with government to date, and particularly some of the work that's been done in the JRG, is focused very heavily on what happens when you come to construction of a new building. Those, in terms of, I've seen various kind of estimates, will probably only amount to a few hundreds of buildings each year, and actually we've just got several thousand buildings out there which are residential and in occupation, and those are the ones we need to be looking at. And so questions about how we do that. And then we get to the question about, well, have we got enough people with the right skills and qualifications to be able to do all of this? And it's not clear that we do. And also, we need to be able to design a regime which is future-proofed, that's able to adapt and flex to new issues and new challenges that come forward, and designing one that's able to respond in that kind of flexible way. And finally, as you'd expect from a local authority kind of lobbying organisation, the key bit is who's going to pay for all of this. And from the council's point of view, both as regulators and building owners, is where does the money come from to fund from the local authority side both the work that we'll be doing as regulators, but also the new requirements and responsibilities that councils will have as building owners. So that's it from me, and I'll hand over, presumably either back to Peter or on to the next presentation.
Thank you very much for your comments there, Mark. I will hand over to Jim in a moment, but just take the opportunity to encourage everyone again to put any questions they have into the Q&A section on the dashboard you can see in front of you. We've already got a few coming in. And also, please do vote up any questions you see on there that you like, because we will take that into account when we move to the Q&A section after Jim's presentation. But without any further delay, Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, Mark, for a very good talk. Hopefully, what I'm going to present is quite complementary to what you've talked about. Really, I've focused really on, in terms of what needs to change. Really, it's not just the regulation and its clarity and the scope, but also about our own individual responsibilities in producing the buildings that we need. It's a bit of a long subject to go through just in 15 minutes, but I'll try and do the best. But please forgive me for any gross generalizations that I make. There's just not enough time to really caveat everything properly as they should be. So the key areas I want to talk about, really looking at some of the recent fires. It's been very interesting seeing what's unfolding in the context of the regulation change, and it's probably quite helpful, disasters as they are, to actually making things evolve in the right direction. Also, after talk about evacuation and stay put policies, access to information, building material toxicity considerations, and the role of sprinklers. Now, obviously, we've seen a range of fires in the news, so I'm just trying to advance the slides. There we go. Thank you. So recent fires, we've had some notable ones in care homes, in hotels, and in apartment blocks. And but we must remember that whilst these look dreadful, that the only mandated requirement of our fire regulations is actually to seek evacuation before collapse. And yes, that happened in all these cases. No one died in all these fires. And really, the determination of whether these are acceptable or not really depends very much on what hat you wear and where you sit. So whilst it's understandable that we see owners, occupiers, fire service, insurers, guests and onlookers, saying how terrible this is, appalling it is as it is to say it, maybe these fires demonstrate a holistic system of fire safety that's actually working quite well. And maybe what we're seeing is the new normal. Our regulations have changed substantially, and maybe this is a look at the future. Obviously, except where there have been obvious illegal design features on any buildings that get found out. But we must never lose sight of the fact that evacuation before collapse is the only mandated requirement in our rules and regulations. Some years ago, the only element for business and property protection one of the measures that were the local acts that were introduced following the Great Fire of London, they were removed some years ago. So there is absolutely no requirement anywhere for property protection. And we're fairly unique in our country to have such a divorce between life safety and property protection. In other countries, it's not uncommon for life safety to follow on, resilient buildings. But there we go. Obviously, preservation of life is not the only measure of success. Business loss, quite understandable, but really the more important ones are the societal impacts. such as disruption and rehoming, education interruption, treatment interruption in hospitals, and loss of healthcare capability. And obviously care homes can have a dreadful impact, and certainly in the care of the old age, and particularly where dementia care is involved, a sudden loss of familiar surroundings can be quite devastating, life-changing, and even possibly life-ending in some cases. So really we need to, in the first instance, broaden the scope of what we see a design success as being. But it's a question of whether people know. And really, awareness is everything, given our lax requirements that we have. And in all these cases, in every building we look at, a few basic questions asked at the time of procurement could radically alter a building design to support better the activities that get carried on without it. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting that any type of construction method is less safe than any other, but we do know that consequential damage can vary greatly between a number of different building methods and the quality with which they're put together, and their susceptibility to fire. And these may well be important, not just from a cost point of view, but for continuation of whatever service that building is providing. And nowadays, if we're perfectly honest, it's not very easy to determine what buildings are being made of, and really disguise plays a large part in many building designs, dressing it up to look traditional, and that may give the impression of a level of resilience that we're used to from bricks and mortar, where it may well respond very differently in actual fact. But actually, identification of building structure building construction is one of the greatest challenge for any insurance surveyor out there. If they're struggling, what chance has a homeowner got, or anyone thinking of putting their relatives into care or their children into school? They may start to take an interest in how well the buildings that they will spend a great deal of time in will afford protection to them. Now, moving on swiftly, stay-put evacuation policies, surely one of the greatest oxymorons out there. As we've mentioned, we have regulations that are designed for evacuation before collapse, yet in some buildings we have an overrider that basically is saying that it's safe to not evacuate. And we've got to look at the reasons for stay-put evacuation policies. I think in the whole debate I've seen some absolutely dreadful reasons cited as to why it's necessary, two of the key ones being the fact that the provision of single staircases, so actually it's unable to support full simultaneous evacuation. And also, you've got to look at the record that we have for the detection systems and the false alarm rates. A good example is from the automatic alarm systems. They have a 96% plus likelihood of the alarm type being false or unwanted. False being it's not a fire at all, and some maybe derived from shower steam or malfunction, and unwanted being something you wouldn't, yes, it triggers an alarm, but you wouldn't want a fire engine launched for, like burnt toast and smoking. Now, these are two things that can be very simply fixed, and really just to put in place a stay-put evacuation policy might be treating a symptom, but it's certainly not treating the cause, and obviously it's going to go horribly wrong one day, and it really nearly has done, and has it not been for the enlightened judgments made by some fire and rescue services on a number of occasions, undoubtedly lives could have been lost were these stay-put policies followed. Do we really want a system where the saving of lives requires an on-the-spot decision such as that to be made? I'd argue not. Clearly, sometimes there may be a case where it's appropriate, but really it needs to be earned very much by the building, and that leads us on to a conversation about the use of non-combustible building materials. Obviously, very high quality of passive fire protection. I would say a reduced reliance upon encapsulation protection methods, and this is where I'm talking about construction methods where poorer performing or combustible materials are encapsulated behind higher performing materials. And we know through life that through wear and tear and alteration, the capability of this encapsulation process may degrade during the lifespan of a building. so we can end up with buildings which become less safe over time. But whatever the reasons are, at the end of the day, for a building, I do believe firmly that intrusive survey is required to see if a building is fit to support a stay put policy. Quite often we see possibly the only place that a building might be compliant is on the paper that's drawn, such are some of the practices that have been observed on site and the quality of installation of key devices such as fire stopping. So there's a lot in that, but really I think it's a key element for consideration with the new and emerging, certainly with the new and emerging building methods that we have coming out. One of the key elements here, I think, to improve things, one needs to change is access to information. And I think it's across the board. Educate private owners of buildings, business managers, service providers alike, that whilst buildings often look the same, the methods and materials that go into them might mean they respond very differently under fire. Now again, I'm not saying that any type of building is any less safe than the other. If anything, our building regulations have proved very effective at ensuring people generally do not die in buildings. But we certainly do know that when you poll the public on what they think the building regulations cover, they believe it covers more than they actually do. And so there is a need for engagement, and certainly there are a number of ways of dealing with this. And one day it'd be lovely to see sort of care homes, schools and universities promoting their services with reference to their safety provisions that they make, be it non-combustible construction or the provision of sprinkler systems, letting everyone know that basically by coming to them, they will be taking care of our loved ones over and above what is mandated in law. And I think that's the key to everything. There's the crossing a very low and grey bar that building regulations provide, and then there's doing the job that needs to be done by way of safety. Now, and I think this is something that's come out of the Hackett report review, that there's more that needs doing. Wouldn't it be lovely to think that maybe Trivago one day would allow you to search for sprinklered hotels exclusively? It's a condition of many organizations in the United States that they will only put their employees in sprinkler-protected hotels. I'd also like to see home builders promoting non-combustible credentials to potential purchasers as a means of making their houses more desirable. So I think you can, and really to raise awareness, certainly at the point of conveyancing, people need to be more engaged across the board with what the home they are thinking of buying is made of and how well that may stand up in terms of resilience and protecting probably one of the most expensive assets they will ever buy in their lives. Now, one of the key and upcoming elements to all of this is BIM and possibly building information modeling, and possibly in there is a way to produce a scoring method for a building's resilience. Obviously, at the moment, we have some competing factors. Obviously, we have mandated life safety requirements for buildings. That's a given. But obviously, very topical these days is environmentally sound buildings and measures for gauging sustainability, such as the BREEAM scheme. But many of these types of pursuits may introduce some undesirable fire resilient features. And really, we do need something to balance this seesaw at the end of the day so that we can understand resilience better, something like the NCAP rating that you can have for cars. But also it can be examining other things like toxicity and why stop at the perils of just fire. We can look at security, flood resilience, all the other perils that people do. And I can't help feeling that certainly businesses, whilst they're quite warmed up to it, with the changing climate that we have, and it's becoming more relevant to the homeowner at the end of the day also. I mentioned toxicity there, and this is something which is starting to get more and more of an airing as we speak. Standards, I think it's our belief that really standards and product selection procedures need to change, and we have some evidence for this. We certainly know that fire ingress from the outside of buildings is becoming easier. And really, we must remember again here that our building regulations are really about fires starting inside rooms and pay little attention to fire ingress from sources outside. We've done extensive research and statistical study and even looking at fires which start from outside. There are certain features in buildings, such as use of plastic air vents, which all too readily allow fire ingress into buildings. And on a number of occasions this has happened. And if it's something like a combustible structure like light timber frame, that a small fire outside can then soon evolve to take down a substantial building. So given that separation from what happens inside and outside is really becoming more relevant, we do need regulation to keep, we believe we need more regulation to keep toxins apart from the occupants. But actually this is where we have some inconsistencies with our fire regulations. We have demonstrated that fire may spread in voids faster than some cavity barriers may react. That's slightly worrying. And we know that toxins in voids, due to the nature of the way they're produced in a very oxygen-lean atmosphere, the toxins are very much more dangerous than when they burn in free air. Certain design features, Mark talked about in his report about 8414 tests needing to change. There is no requirement for fire stop devices going through the external envelope of a building. It doesn't form part of the fire compartment. And yet we can show very clearly in the laboratory that in a cladding system with a plastic vent through it, that the toxic byproducts of burning insulation, ACM, can enter into, well, basically can communicate that smoke to all areas connected with these devices, to kitchens and bathrooms, and can produce lethal atmospheres all too readily. That report is all downloadable from the FPA website. If you type in the word toxicity under search, and you'll see it paints a fairly bleak picture. So I think we've got a situation where it's quite clear that our regulations do not separate humans or occupants from the building products well enough currently. And since the evaluation of toxicity of building products forms no part of their suitability assessment for use in buildings, clearly we believe there is a job that needs to be done. But really just before I close out, another large question that comes up is the role of sprinklers. Now this is a really, really interesting one because there's been a massive proliferation of the installation of sprinklers, particularly in tall buildings, post-Grenfell. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it's only one part of the building fire management strategy. They do not compensate for all other undesirable shortcomings unless they're specifically designed to do so. The design could change very much based on whether you're talking about vulnerable people, lack of compartmentation, combustible cladding, evacuation issues, specialist fire loads, where hoarding takes place. They do need very careful consideration if they are to do the job, and really they form one strand of the building's fire management policy. Any suppression system still needs a good passive envelope to work within. So really to think that you just put in a sprinkler system, and they are very good obviously, but think that it will cater for all other shortcomings in that building, and it's the only solution, and will prevent the need to take any other action, well, that could be have some grave consequences at the end of the day. They are designed to really simply get people to a place of relative safety, which might just be the landing, not necessarily out of the building. It's really up to the rest of the plan to assure the safe egress. Now, there are some challenges which we have been following in the rollout of sprinkler systems, particularly in the multi-story environment. There can be confusion between the fire engineer and the sprinkler surveyor as to who has responsibility for designing the system. That needs sorting out. Third-party certification of product design and install all needs supporting, because we have seen one or two bad installations out there which can lead to further consequences which may certainly cause harm and displacement from property for other reasons, such as no less escape of water. But really, just to take a bad building and put sprinklers in, I guess if you're being harsh, you could just say it's really like putting lipstick on a pig. There is a full and proper job needs to be done, and that must never be forgotten. So I think I've probably covered off most of the areas which I want to talk about. So just in summary, on terms of what needs to change, really we do need greater clarity on the very limited design objective of current regulations. I really believe that this harms the ability of people to make good decisions or know that they need to make decisions when called upon to do so. Certainly we see designs where if you ask for nothing else, you'll get things designed down to, as I say, this low-grey bar that is allowed. We do need an improved means of communicating the design objective better to support the decision-making process and really get much better engagement with business, homeowners, occupants, anyone commissioning a building as to what it can do. The use of stay-put policies must be for good reasons, not bad ones. It sounds silly, but it's probably very important to assess that. And it should be earned on the back of intrusive testing of the delivered building, not just how the building should be produced on paper. We do need a method for rating buildings for resilience. Toxicity must be either accounted for or protected against. The current situation, it does neither, and I believe that a lot of effort is required there, and there are a lot of people pursuing this at this moment in time. In terms of sprinkler provision, we believe that it should be targeted on those they benefit most, and that will encourage the right sort of money to go into being put into putting quality sprinkler systems where they're most required, rather than possibly cheaper systems that may perform less well as a blanket. And also we would like the specification of non-combustible materials because really at the end of the day it fixes many of the issues that we've been talking about. Buildings are much less likely to age poorly in terms of their safety, and as Mark suggested, we are slightly it's a difficult argument as to why there should be the 18-meter requirement for buildings. And certainly as FPA, we support very much for this ban to be comprehensive for any height of building. I think that's all I had to say, so I shall hand back to Pete, and thank you very much indeed.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Jim, for that very thorough presentation. That was very enlightening. We'll move on to a question and answer session now. We've got just over 10 minutes. So I'll dive straight into some of the ones that have been submitted by our audience. There's a question right at the top, which has been quite popular with people upvoting it, from Sarah Craggs, which is about the new build block of flats and who would be responsible for producing a fire escape action plan for these new buildings. I think it taps into some of what you were saying just now, Jim, about earning the right to have a stay-put policy, and perhaps if a building is not going to have a stay-put policy, who is responsible for figuring out how that building should be evacuated. So, Jim, perhaps I'll come to you with that question.
Well, yes, probably the majority of this falls more into Mark's, but what I would say is one of the things which we've been acutely aware of is there is a sort of a lack of knowledge of the right roles and responsibilities. At the end of the day, you have a main contractor working for a client, and maybe it's somewhere in there is a fire engineer. And so on behalf of the main contractor or the client, the fire engineer might be producing the fire management plan for the building. And that includes really producing the holistic plan, which will include building management, the automatic fire detection systems, emergency lighting, sprinkler system design, the passive design elements of the building. And these all need bringing together. So the crucial thing is that it is holistic. And I think in answer to the question, an evacuation policy is another strand of that. It needs to be absolutely consistent with all these other elements of the building. Its passive capability, what active protection is in there, the emergency lighting, the detection, and how the building is managed. And Hackett is very keen on this, that there is a single point of focus. We have detected, particularly with sprinkler system installation, that these rules or this process is not always correctly followed, and people just say, yep, I want a sprinkler system, and they leave it to the sprinkler contractor to put in what they think's best. That's not how it should be. It should be a requirement from the fire engineer, the only person with visibility of the total fire management plan, to say, actually, I want a sprinkler system, and for my plan, it needs to do this, because I'm the only person aware of the occupancy of the building and all the other design constraints and competing elements that need to be brought into play.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So the idea that you can't section these things off, you have to look at it in the round. We'll also pick up another quite popular question from James Elms, which I would see as expressing some frustration towards building control and developers for failing to pick up simple things such as gaps around doors, necessary fire stopping, missing intumescent strips, and so on. Perhaps a bit of a question in there about the sometimes poor quality of these building works and what the government may do to coerce the industry to get a bit better at this. Mark, you've been involved in some of the Hackitt Review discussions and some of the discussions with MHCLG. What sorts of things may we see from government in this area?
So the thinking there is that, as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, is that duty holders, however defined, and what they're talking about is something that's based on the CDM regulations, which come to health and safety on the construction work site, and using those, as Jim was saying, effectively as a kind of a template as to who will be responsible for ensuring that the quality of work that's done during the construction is to the, addresses some of those issues that have been identified in the question. Alongside that, government is also talking about, and there's been quite a bit of work done by the industry itself to look at how you improve the competency of those people working on these buildings. So that's another strand of where they're looking at, is to ensure that when it comes to doing the work, that the people who are doing it know what they're doing and the importance of the things that they're working with and what role they play in the overall system of fire protection for that particular building. And alongside that comes what will the new regulatory framework look like. And for buildings in scope, the government thinking at the moment is that there will be a process whereby when you've got to Gateway 2, which is the one where effectively sort of got building regulations kind of, or rather the plan which the building control people look at alongside the other regulators, that will then be developed by the regulators, whether that's, and it's not clear at the moment, as I said, whether or not that's a national regulator or the local ones, but we still seem to be in a position where we're talking about local delivery of this. There will be a process whereby, and there is an agreed inspection plan for the building going forward, where the regulators will go out and inspect key elements of the work that's being done. So one might anticipate that we see a greater number of visits by building control people in the future for buildings in scope to go out and inspect the quality of work that is being done, and that they do that at key points in the construction of the building, particularly when important elements related to fire safety are being built and put in place, so that those sorts of things are picked up during construction, and that in effect the regulator is able to check what they have been told by the people doing the work and planning it and commissioning it, that the proposals and measures they've got in place to ensure the quality of work is to the standard required. Effectively, the regulator will be checking that that's happening. So there's a number of different strands in there that the government's trying to pick up to ensure that those widespread problems that many people have seen and raised elsewhere are addressed in the future.
Thanks, Mark. That's really interesting insight. I think certainly some changes to the way building control operates seem to be likely, given many of the things that have been said since Grenfell. I also want to pick up on a question. There's been a couple of questions about the document Advice Note 14. Just for anyone in the webinar who's not aware of what that is, it was released by MHCLG in December. And was advice to the owners of buildings who had cladding systems that did not incorporate an ACM material. There was advice there to investigate those and potentially remove them depending on the the specific materials used. I'm aware from many sources that that's caused quite a lot of ripples out into the industry, and one of the ones which Rachel Dobson has raised is the huge resistance from fire engineers in producing the statements that are required to effectively take the building apart to confirm it's been installed correctly. And there's been some talk between MHCLG and RICS to discuss the issue. Does anyone know how to overcome this impasse if you need to find out what forms your facade and you are unable to do it without that sort of intrusive work? I'll throw into that as well a question slightly lower down from Andy McKay, who is talking about compliance with Advice Note 14 before the issuance of mortgages or remortgaging. It relates to the same issue, but how do you get this testing done? How do you assure lenders and so on when there's sometimes quite patchy information about what's on the outside of the building?
Yeah.
Either Jim or Mark to come into that.
I'm happy to start just from one perspective. The Advice Note 14 was brought out before the concept of the exemptions of materials for external cladding systems. So actually, it's probably pretty impossible to comply with, I would imagine. But it is causing problems, and it's a particularly difficult one to sort out, and I can quite understand why people are struggling to get fire engineers to produce the sort of report that they're looking for. It's quite a brave thing to do. In terms of, we are aware that they're being asked for at time of purchase of flats and things, and it's very difficult to doing that. But we need to remember that mortgage providers, at the end of the day, what they fall back on is if people stop their mortgage payments, then the flat becomes theirs, and they need to know that it will have a preserved value. And obviously, if it gets revealed at a later date that it hasn't been put together properly or in the right way, then they may have lent a lot of money against something that's worth considerably less. So I can see how this certainly comes about and why it's a problem. The solution is difficult, and I can't really help with it at this moment in time. Maybe Mark has something more on it.
Unfortunately, Jim, like you, I haven't got an immediate solution to the problem, and like you, it's understandable, and we always kind of thought that one of the drivers for change in what happens on buildings would be the response of the insurance industry to the scenario that we've been finding post Grenfell, and that I think from the point of view of a cautious insurance industry or mortgage lender position is that you want to be assured of the quality of the building that you're either lending the money on or providing insurance for, and that what we've seen, as I said, quite a lot of it anecdotal in terms of people uncovering stuff when they've stripped things off and had a look beneath the rain screen cladding, and what they found in terms of quality of workmanship has suggested a range of fire safety issues related to the way that the materials are being used and installed, and that therefore entirely understandable as to why people would be cautious about doing that. And I think were I on the insurance industry side, I would be saying, well, yeah, I'd want to see something from a fire engineer which suggests that they've poked around behind the rain screen cladding and looked at all of it, and can assure me that it's all okay, because broadly what we've picked up elsewhere suggests that it's not. So, but as Jim says, I can't see a solution, an easy solution to this immediate problem, other than one that sees, work done to buildings which addresses some of those issues going forward. But unfortunately, of course, that has considerable cost attached to it. And this question, in private blocks, where does that fall?
That's right. I think there's a danger here that probably insurers and the mortgage lenders could be kind of quite unfairly branded as the baddies in all of this, but actually they are dealing in strict business terms with something which is not of their making. Certainly in previous dealings with the relationship between insurance and mortgage lending, I remember a meeting with Council of Mortgage Lenders of certain building types. They will lend as long as insurers will insure. So there is a relationship between the two, and when one or other becomes uneasy, we do end up in this situation.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim and Mark. I think I'm going to just throw in a last question, by way of also giving you a chance to make some concluding comments as well. The one of the real questions about this is what's going to happen next, and looking forward over the next year. One of the main events we have coming up, which has been touched upon, is the Martin Morbick report from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. But I'd just like to give both of you a minute or so to give your thoughts on either what you expect to come out of that report that you're really waiting on and feel might be significant for people who manage buildings, or something that the government might do or needs to do that will change the picture again. So, Mark, let's come to you first. What are the big things to think about over the next 6 months or a year?
Yeah, you're right to identify the Grenfell inquiry. I mean, I don't, from our perspective, I don't think that we're anticipating all of the things that we will need from the inquiry with its first report, which obviously focused on what happened in fighting the fire on the day. Or on the night that it happened, and they're obviously, from wearing a different hat that I do within the LJ, with responsibility for fire and rescue services, would obviously pay very keen attention to what that says in terms of fighting fires in high-rise buildings and what that means for the fire and rescue service. What does it mean more broadly in terms of building safety? I think actually we need to wait for his second stage of his report to look at that, and for his analysis, and whether that accords with Dame Judith about the fundamental problems within the construction industry and the regulatory framework which have led to where Grenfell was. I think the key bit from our perspective over the next year that needs to happen is we need whichever government it is, and given the political environment in which we are, is that whoever that is that we need to see a piece of legislation introduced early next year which drives forward the Hackett reforms and introduces those as a comprehensive package in 2020, with presumably implementation from then on in 2021. We'll then be 3 years on from the fire, and one of the key things that everyone, I think, across the party on the parliamentary side, but outside in the rest of the country as well, was that we don't want to see anything like this happening again. Our view is that we're probably in a scenario where currently we're lucky that nothing like it has happened. The fire in Barking recently was a near miss, even though it was a building below 18 metres in height. And my understanding, speaking to some of the people involved in that, was that had that fire occurred at night, then we might have been looking at something that resulted in fatality. So the key bit from our perspective is we need to see the legislation in place that introduces the new regulatory framework that Dame Judith Hackett has set out.
Sorry, thank you for that, Mark. Jim, concluding comments for you. I appreciate we're running slightly over time, so as brief as you can be.
Yes, of course. I think, in my mind, the most interesting thing that will come out of this is really the detail of the events of the day. There has always been a commonly held belief that the toxic challenge from a fire is from the contents of a room, but we'd like to see if that is still the view after there's a full analysis of the fire and what's happened, because actually, as soon as you start to consider toxicity, then that as a criteria for selecting appropriate materials to be put on buildings, then it can radically change everything.
Okay, all right. Well, very interesting views from both of you, and thanks very much for everyone who submitted questions. I do hope you found this webinar useful, and please do stay in tune with everything that's being written on Inside Housing. We cover this issue in an awful lot of detail, and we will be putting out the slides and the recording of the webinar for anyone who has missed bits of it or wants to listen back to it. So thanks to both of the speakers, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I do hope you've got what you need to get out of it.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.